Well, good evening and welcome again to this second of four technical seminars that we're running as part of the reporting process for a year-long project looking at the development of a results-based approach to supporting the sustainable management of common land. The project's going to end on the 31st of October, and it's a leader cooperation project funded by 6 local action groups in South Wales and co-funded by Natural Resources Wales. I'll just start sharing my screen since you all seem to have arrived. Okay. Just reduce my one picture. Okay. So the reason for the project, just to recap, for those of you who didn't come last week, just in brief, the reason for the project was the aspirations set out in the Welsh Government's Brexit and Our Land consultation paper a year or two ago now, which said that they want to establish a new and flexible public goods scheme. And the scheme, they want to enable land managers to be paid for the production of outcomes for which there's currently no market. So that aspiration broadly remains the same, I think, even though what it means in practice maybe is changing slightly. And we thought that there was a big gap there in how it might be done on common land, a gap which needed some thinking space. And so we put in for some money to do that thinking ourselves. And that's okay. So that need for thinking apparently still exists. So last week, the Welsh Government brought out a forward plan for its policy reform process. And in it, it stressed again how important common land is and how it should attract greater attention. But then it also said that it was basically lacking ideas from stakeholders. And so this project, which aims to fill that gap, is actually still needed 2 years on. So that's something that's reassuring to us that our work potentially is not in vain. Okay, so tonight's presentation, we'll have a bit of an introduction. And then we'll talk about possible approaches to designing payments. And then we'll talk about what we actually did, what the approach was that we took. And then we'll talk just at the end, remind ourselves that we need also some complementary funding supports. The area payments can't do everything. So last week we looked at public goods and how those could be potentially brought together and made into a coherent message which can be used in a scorecard. But of course the scorecard is only one side of it, one side of the incentive, one side of the carrot that the grazier gets. The other side is the payment that goes along with the score, the scale of it, and how it's designed. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So the overall aim of this element of the project is something like this. So we want to be paying graziers and others for the cost of management and for organizing it, because of course it's a common grazing. It's something that has higher transaction costs than just a normal farm. And we want those payments to be reasonable. And we want them to be reasonable throughout that spectrum of scores. So it's not only that they make sense for a score of 10, but they make sense also for a score of 3 or a score of 8. And those payments, of course, they exist in a set of international rules in the WTO. So we need them to be WTO compliant. And we need them particularly because that's something that's often forgotten, to give a fair reward to the graziers themselves for their own labour. And we want to pick a way of doing it that's the most fair and the most effective in any particular circumstance. And the underlying assumption we have, which we took from Brexit and Our Land and the subsequent policy documents, is that this scheme will be the only area-based scheme available. So there's nothing else to fall back on, nothing else to pick up the pieces. This is it. There might be complementary things, but there's no other area-based scheme. So that's an underlying assumption. We'll come back to that. One thing to remind ourselves, I think, is very important, that whether or not we're in the EU, we're under WTO rules. So a lot of the rules that farmers in the past have characterized as being from Brussels actually are from the WTO, to which the UK itself is also a signatory. And so the WTO applies rules to payment to payments to try to limit the opportunities for unfairly subsidizing farmers in one country compared to other countries. So it's got a set of criteria, a set of classifications, and a set of rules that payments should be adhering to. And you might be aware that the WTO Agreement on Agriculture classifies different types of payment into different categories. So you may have heard of the amber box, for example. So the amber box is a trade distorting payment. So headage payments would be amber box. You may be aware that there's headage payments for suckler calves, for example, in Scotland. So that's an amber box payment. And those amber box payments are limited to a certain percentage of all payments at the member state, at the state level, so at the UK level. And the move just now is towards green box payments. So these are payments that are not trade distorting. And because they're not trade distorting, then the WTO has no particular interest in the scale of them, excuse me, because it doesn't have an impact on producers in other countries. So agri-environment and climate schemes, of course, are examples of green box payments, so Gloucester in our case, but so also is the basic payment scheme. So the basic payment scheme isn't linked anymore to the number of animals you have or the amount of cereals you produce or whatever. So that's a green box payment also. Alongside these general categories, the WTO also has specific rules for schemes which are explicitly agri-environment. And those schemes, those rules say that those schemes can only give payments that are connected to two things, which are income forgone and additional costs. So the idea here is that you only give payments for things which are have a real impact on the farmer's business. So you're not trying to subsidize them sneakily by the back door. You're giving payments which compensate for reductions in income that the farmers had as a result of your commitments, that's the income forgone, or the additional cost that the farmer has for doing new things that he wasn't doing as part of his supposedly optimal management. And these are the rules under which all the agri-environment schemes, since ESA and till come in or whatever, all of those have been under these rules. But I think we should note in passing that not all payments which have an environmental rationale have to be, strictly speaking, agri-environment payments. And we should note, I think, that the aspiration of Welsh Government, at least in some of the papers, I'm not sure if it's still the case, I think it is that we move away from this, this limitation, that we can pay for some other, well, by implication, higher amount of money on some other rationale. So this is to remind us that not all green box payments have to be really, really strict in their rationale. So BPS, of course, is a classic example of that. So what's it based on? What are these costs that BPS relates to? It's very, very unclear. In fact, it's completely opaque. But it's still green box compliant because it doesn't encourage production. But actually, we didn't go down that route. We didn't go down a route other than agri-environment. We couldn't really see, if we weren't using additional costs and income forgone, what there was to base them on, which was solid. Income forgone additional costs, they seem quite rigid, but they're very definite. It's very clear what they are, and it's not very clear what you would do that was different from them, that would also be robust. And of course, if you did come up with other bases, then it would immediately place additional pressure on you to justify it. So whether that was at the Welsh level, certainly at the UK level, and potentially at the WTO level. And we need to remind ourselves again, I suppose, that actually not having a defensible rationale is one of the main arguments that Welsh government makes against BPS. You know, it's this question again, well, what is it based on? It's not particularly based on anything. So if we replace it by something that doesn't have a strong rationale, then we're back in the same fire we just escaped from. So one potential rationale, I suppose, or one potential way of looking at things is that actually we give a reward for delivering what the public wants. So willingness to pay and this kind of thing. But then the question is, well, what is a fair reward? So if we're saying that compensating the farmer for the additional costs or for the income forgone is not enough, well, what is enough? At what point do we say, well, this is giving good value for money, and then a pound extra is giving bad value for money? Well, how do we judge that if we're not looking at the farmer's costs? There's also the question, I think, of whether what the public wants is the same as what the policy wants. Public is rather fickle, I would say. It's rather easily led, you know, by the media, by social media, etc. And so, okay, it might be willing to pay for the red kite, let's say, but is it willing to pay for invertebrates? Is it willing to pay for fungi, even though these make up the bulk of our biodiversity, etc. So it raises a lot of questions, I think. And then, of course, if you don't pay for additional costs and income forgone, then you're explicitly saying, well, we're not just going to pay for your costs, we're going to pay above your costs. We're going to give you more than your costs warrant. And at a time when public expenditure is under pressure, especially in Wales, I think, but throughout the UK and throughout the world, we might say after COVID, is that going to be something that's easy to justify? And if it pays farmers and graziers for things that go on beyond their cost, isn't that going to be converted in the case of tenants, which of course doesn't apply here, but in the case of tenants immediately into their rent, and over the long term into land values? I mean, okay, you could say that doesn't apply to common land, so don't worry your pretty little head about it. But that's a big concern, I think, on the wider scale. I'll just give you an example of the kind of issues that soon arise. So we talked last week about the sequestration of carbon and how slow it is. And so if there's a payment for ecosystem services for sequestering carbon, it's not really going to be very lucrative. So what if you have an excellent, well-functioning peat bog? So you might have, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, whatever of peat. And it's quite understandable, I think, if the payment for sequestration is low, to say, well, I should be rewarded for the stuff that's there already. And you could make that case not just for peat, of course, but for all these other organic soils that we mentioned last time. But consider this. This is the Llangatug escarpment. So whereas the bog had 2, 3, 4 meters of peat, Llangatug escarpment has 100 meters plus of limestone. So that's all containing carbon. So why shouldn't we pay the owner of the Llangatug escarpment, the landowner there? Why shouldn't we pay that person for the store of carbon? It soon grows like topsy, and you lose any anchor that tells you, well, okay, this is where we stop. And so for this reason, we haven't pursued this non-WTO agri-environment approach. We've stuck to the thoughts of income forgone and additional costs because we think that actually they have a lot of mileage. And we think that not because of our own ideas, but because work has been done to look into it. So this report is quite old now, 2011, by a lot of former colleagues there. And they did this work for the Land Use Policy Group, which looked into the limitations or not of the WTO rules for agri-environment. And what they pointed out was, it depends what the question means, doesn't it? You know, it depends what income forgone actually means, which income is forgone. Depends what additional cost means, which costs are additional. So the standard approach in agri-environment, as we'll come back to in the next slide or two, the standard approach, you know, tends to isolate out the particular change that you want to happen, and it assumes that everything else is profitable, and it looks at the exact costs of that, or the exact income forgone of that, and avoids the question of viability altogether. But of course, the best payments, the most realistic payments, the best payments reflect reality. They're the ones where the incentive is most realistic, obviously, because they're based on reality. And reality includes situation where agriculture, even the whole system, is loss-making. And that's often the case on the type of agriculture we see in common land. Or it at least offers very low net income. So net income where the grazier for the delivery of public goods, you know, so these are things for which there's not a market other than what the government is providing through this scheme, that they get less than the minimum wage, for example. So, well, we should be able to respond to that, surely. Or indeed, there might be situations where the income is low enough in agriculture that the wider economy is a much better offer for the grazier, potential offer for the grazier, or for the sons and daughters of graziers when they come to have the chance to be graziers themselves. And these can be real costs that have real impacts in the system. And this document by Barnes et al. Says, well, that's okay, so long as you can justify it and you can describe it and you can quantify it, that's okay. You can take these things into account in your income forgone additional costs. So the rules can cope with it. So that's a message of hope, I think, really. And as we go through it, then I hope you'll see that actually we can make it work potentially for common land. So these payments are based on a story. So there has to be a story that has a certain rationale, which leads you to think, then I need the payments. So for income forgone, then that rationale works something like this. So your system is profitable, and what you're doing is optimal for the profitability of that system. And the undertakings that you make for agri-environment mean that you move away from that optimum in some way. And because of that, you make less profit, and then the payments will fill that gap. So the additional costs approach is a bit different. So it starts from the point of view that your activities cost you money, and of course that's obvious. But in profitable farming, the income is more than the costs. But we're in a world now where that's not necessarily the case, and we might even be in a world where all your costs are greater than all your income. That's quite possible in the types of systems we're thinking about. But when we look at the agri-environment outcomes, we realize that doing things is necessary to achieve the results we want. And of course, doing more things costs you more. And the payments then are addressing the costs of doing what's needed. So what's needed, of course, to deliver the outcomes, the results that government wants. So if we look at Glastir, reflect on Glastir, Glastir takes the first approach. So, as I said to you last week, I think, if you go to the rural development plan, the full text of it, then you'll see the rationale of the various payments in Glastir, how they were calculated. And the underlying assumption is that Welsh farming systems are all profitable. Even after decoupling, they're all profitable. I should just say in passing that it only looks at gross margin, so it doesn't consider the farmer's net income at all, which I don't think is a particularly holistic way to look at things. Anyway, within that profitable system, there's a certain economically rational behavior relating to each habitat. So for example, it could be 0.7 livestock unit per hectare for a semi-natural grassland that's quite productive, let's say. And then there's the agri-environment rationale, if you want to put it that way, that in order to achieve a better result, then you want farmers to do less. And okay, I think if I'm really honest here, really fair to Glasgow, if you look at the description of the measure and the guidance, of course, it doesn't just say do less. It says come into this band of activity. But the payments are only for doing less. And there's nothing to keep you even at the lower band of the activity in lots of cases. So there's no support payment there. There's only an encouragement to reduce. And then, of course, for the farmer, that doing less is set out in all these ways that we know only too well. So that approach surely has some weaknesses, I think. So when it comes to common land, we go out there and we see that a lot of commons are not farmed, in fact, they're not grazed, or they're at a low level of grazing. So if the system is so profitable, wouldn't they be overrun with livestock? That's not how it is, actually. We look also at what expert tells us and what we see with our own eyes, and public goods delivery seems to need actual grazing management, sometimes more grazing management, sometimes actually even more grazing, and often more cattle in particular. But there's nothing really in the rationale of the payment that tells graziers that, or that gives encouragement for that. I think myself that it's not acceptable to pay farmers properly for delivering public goods. But those costs are not taken into account in Gloucester just now. So I think that they should get at least the minimum wage, surely. If they're working for the government, which is what we're saying here with the case of public goods, they're working for the government to deliver its objectives, then they should get at least the minimum wage. I'd say that they should get more, I think, but at least the minimum wage. And of course, we're talking also about commons here. And on commons, we have this complicated situation of people who have rights and don't use them. And so encouraging positive management, people doing the right thing, doing the appropriate thing, it's very difficult when the payments are only based on doing less. And so people, as I say here, people who are doing nothing, they're doing the best thing, aren't they? So they have none of the costs, they have none of the risk of penalties or anything. So that in effect, they're a burden on the people who are doing something and who are incurring the costs. But Glasgow and its message of the payment rationale doesn't really do anything about that. It puts a blind eye to that, so it turns a blind eye to that. So what we've tried to do is to take the opposite approach, really. So to take the additional cost approach, so that we can describe the payments in a way which say we want to reward positive things, and in a way that suggests very strongly to grazing associations that the money should go to the people who are incurring the costs, because we've described the costs and what they are. So how did we do that? Well, we started with the default farming. So there's no BPS anymore, of course. So we can't assume, well, the normal farming goes on, and that's sort of supported by BPS, even though it's decoupled, which is a very strange way of looking at things. But let's say that that's the way it is just now. Normal farming is supported by BPS, so that's all right. So we just pay for the change. We can't do that anymore because there's not going to be a BPS. That's what the proposal says. And so we have to pay for we have to think about paying for the default farming first before we start changing it. So we went to the IBERS data. So this is the actual sheet. I see there's a new one out just now, but we'll stick to the old one for the next month. And the IBERS data actually is a bit, throws you a bit when you see it, first of all, because it says that net farm income is positive on hill sheep farming, on hill sheep farms. But then you look more closely at what they include and what they don't include. And of course, they don't include the cost of family labour, so the cost of the farmer and the farmer's spouse. And when they build that in, at the very bottom of the sheet there, management and investment income, then you see that what looked like a profit then becomes a loss. And it's a loss of just over £273 per livestock unit, according to the number of livestock units on this sample of farms. So that's, you could say that doesn't take account of everything, but we think it's a good starting point. Then if we're still talking about hill sheep farming, so we're not talking about cattle particularly here now. If we look at Glastir allows for the fact that conservation management is a bit more demanding than normal management. And so it allows an hour and a half of extra management time per hectare, which we cost at $22.50. Excuse me, we cost at $22.50. So that's the sort of starting point. That's the basement of farming. But when we went out to these different commons, whether it was speaking to the graziers themselves or whether it was speaking to NRW, it seemed very clear to us that cattle would be a positive addition where they were missing, and were a positive aspect of the current management where they occurred already. And that indeed that encouraging more cattle usually would be a good thing on almost all the commons we went to. I can't think of one off the top of my head where that wasn't the case. So back we went to IBERS to see what the data published says about hill cattle. This was very strange when it came to it. I was very surprised. So IBERS suggests that hill cattle are more profitable than hill sheep. And that's really, really, whether you include the family labor or not, it says that. So that's really, really difficult to reconcile with what you see in the real world. So it's quite clear that the default farming on commons and the mountains is sheep farming. And on lots of commons, you don't see any cattle. And on lots of farms, you don't see any cattle. So if what IBERS says is true, you'd think there'd be at least some cattle on every farm, wouldn't you? To boost the profitability, and that's not what we see. So there must be things which are missing from the IBERS calculation, which are actually a real cost in the real world. So we spoke to various people to try and make a list of the kind of things that might be. Those might be. And we came up with this list. We're not saying it's exhaustive, but it seems to cover a lot of what people said. So the cost of wintering, that's definitely a limiting factor. Whether cattle are wintered at home or feed is brought in or they're wintered away, doesn't matter. There's an extra cost for wintering on hill farms with very limited in-by land. There's extra labour costs. This is just of managing cattle normally, commercially on the hill, as well as extra labour costs on top of that for the conservation management of cattle on hills. Most people, when they go to common, they have extra TB costs, testing costs, so we need to include them for sure. And then there's a whole swathe of costs which are associated with these large upland parcels particularly, so unfenced parcels that can be equally lowland. I was on Fairwood Common today. That's an area with lots of problems due to unfenced roads. And parcels also that have mixing of stock between different farms. That also adds to costs. So that's the list that we looked at. And so this is how we went about trying to establish what they might be. So we started with wintering. Very difficult to get information on that. I tried to get it from various colleagues and they didn't have it. But fortunately, some work was done quite a few years ago now by Duchy College for Dartmoor National Park Authority. And they worked out at that time that the cost of wintering a cow for 6 months, a 6 months winter, was of the order of £208 per cow. So it was a long time ago, so I don't think costs have gone down since then, so we're using that. But we know it's quite old data, so people might have thoughts of how to update it. Then we looked at the extra labour costs of managing cattle on a hill as opposed to not on a hill. And when we looked at the IBERS data, we couldn't get anything useful out of it. And I think the reason is that it's not hilly enough, really. So if you look at the description of the farms that are within the hill data set, they have a lot of in-by ground and a really quite a small proportion of hill. And so you don't know, of course, whether these hill cattle are actually on the mountain or whether they're just on a hill farm as defined. So the solution we found to that, I think, is quite robust, actually, even though it sounds like it wouldn't be representative. I think it is actually quite representative. And that was Quality Meat Scotland data. So that's the equivalent of Hybiki Cymru. They produce annual enterprise costings for cattle and sheep. It's a very good document. And if you look at their hill cattle and upland cattle data sets and look at the details of the costs, what you find is that the wintering costs in the two data sets are very similar. In other words, there's no real difference in management over the winter. And that's not surprising if you think about it, because the cows are mostly inside, both of them. But the hill cattle have an extra labour cost overall. And it's 10 hours per livestock unit. And so we think we can't think what else it could be other than the extra cost of them being on the hill and the management that implies. So we've taken that as being the case. Then for the TB tests, we got some information from the local vet in Lampeter here. So as those of you with cattle know, there's a fixed cost and then there's a per animal cost. So the net cost per animal reduces as the herd increases. So we've just taken it for a 20 animal herd and it comes out to just short of £14. And then the extra labour costs of managing heavy animals, that's given by Glasssteer calculations, is £15 a hectare. So it's an hour a hectare extra a year. Turning then to the extra costs of unfenced parcels with mixing of stock. There's a number of things, isn't there? And these definitely aren't exhaustive. So there's costs which are additional to the normal additional labour. So for example, Buckland Common is over 5,000 hectares, but that's unfenced against many other large commons. So, you might be talking 10,000 hectares of wandering space. So it's not surprising there's a lot of additional labour potentially. Cost of injury and death caused by vehicles is a big thing. And it's not something which we would try and put into an area payment. I don't think it's really serious, and it varies a lot, of course, between commons. Some commons don't have a road, some have a very busy road, and quite a few of the commons in our sample of 12 have that problem, whether it's on Llangatog in the east or Fairwood in the west, or Cross in the middle. Then there's additional cost of TB. So we thought in the area payment of the cost of the test, but of course that's not the real cost of TB in the way it influences management for these places. So first of all, there's the implications of a TB breakdown in another herd, which is also on the common. So that has a ripple effect on everybody else that's using the common. And then as a counter to that is the fact, excuse me, the fact that farmers have to make adjustments of management to avoid those costs. So you hear of commons where only one person goes out and everybody else, once that person goes out, can't put the stock out. So that's a management adjustment which has costs. And then there's also wider effects of disturbance and how changes to systems have to be made to adapt to it. And we don't think these are necessarily solvable. They may or may not be, but it's certainly not a cost we're building in. It's just too, you can't grasp it really in a generalizable way. But actually, during the lifetime of the project almost, an apparent solution to a lot of these things has arisen. And that's these no fence collars, these electric collars, which are phone app linked and GPS linked, and they have the potential to be a game changer. So we'll come back to that after we've talked about the area payment in particular, but they are something that's potentially very, very useful in the future. I think they have a big role. So to come back to the cost that we did include, the final thing is transaction costs, of course. So on a common, half the battle is getting on with each other and deciding how to assign responsibilities and rights and payments and all this kind of thing. And that takes time and that takes effort. So we think, we'll come back to this in the final of the 4 webinars. We think that the additional costs should be standalone. They shouldn't be built into the area payment, and we'll come back to that in 2 weeks' time. But there's annual costs all the same. So somebody has to score the common annually. So we would hope, and I think the Graziers would hope, that they would have a role in this and potentially an ever-increasing role. But that's a cost. It means that some would take the responsibility, some would get the training, and there would be a cost to it. They should get paid, I think. So there's that kind of thing. And then when the scores come in, then there has to be an annual discussion, how to respond to them. So should there be management changes? Should there be an application for some one-off actions? That kind of thing. And so that again is a transaction cost. Potentially a few hours, a few days of people's time talking things through, getting advice, maybe getting experts to come in and give some additional input. These all have costs. And then there's the administrative costs, of course, administrative costs, administering the finances, adjusting to changes in the Graziers. So new entrants might come in, old people might retire, Graziers might die. So that all has a cost, and it's a cost that doesn't really occur on a sole use farm. So it's something that needs to be recognized specifically in the case of commons. Excuse me. So at least some of these are matters for this association. So even if there's project officers that the state is paying for, which there could be, and then there's still some costs for the association for sure. And they're things that you want to encourage because you want to encourage engagement, you want to encourage capacity locally to be built. But the more the capacity and the engagement is built, the more expectations you have of the Graziers, then the more the costs they have. And in the case, of course, if there's no project officers, then there would be the need to pay advisors at some points anyway. Okay, so we're including some transaction costs. So this is a summary of all the things we've talked about now, not counting the no fence collars. So these are all the things that we're suggesting should be included in consideration of an area payment. And you can see, if I can make this work, yes. You can see some of them are per livestock unit and some of them are per hectare. And so, of course, to make it per hectare, you have to have some assumption of what the stocking density is. And you can put various stocking densities through the sum and get different values coming out for the different stocking densities. And that's what we did. So this is stocking density varying here. This is pounds here, and that's how it varies for different stocking densities, all using the same data. Okay. But this isn't our payment rate. We haven't connected this to scores at all. And the way we've chosen to use this is to extract some anchoring points, if we can call them that, out of this relationship. And so the way we've done this is to look back again at the assumptions that are in the RDP from Glastir. And so, for example, for the most species-rich habitat, so limestone grassland, calcareous grassland, these are ones that would get a really high score in our scorecard. You'd expect them to if they were well managed. Glastir assumes that you need something of the order of 0.7 livestock units a hectare to achieve a good result there. which is just over £400 a hectare according to our costs. And so we'll use that in the scoring matrix you see in the next slide as an anchoring point. And then we can find another anchoring point. If you look at heathland and the figures that they have there, there's a bit of variation, but something of the order of 2 ewes a hectare, 0.3 livestock units a hectare. That's the kind of assumption that the RDP makes about the conditions that are needed to deliver a good heathland. So we'll use that in our matrix again as an anchoring point. And this is how we've done it. So we've put them in a straight line. That's the simplest solution. And you can see that we've anchored our graph to the 2 things that we mentioned. So we're saying, well, our best scoring commons, scoring 10, will be these species-rich limestone pastures and coastal grasslands. And so these are the best ones, and we know that those going to take this 0.7 livestock units, or roughly, and the payment that we calculated for that was just over £400. And in a similar way, we know that there's a group of habitats somewhere in the middle here, which are not as species rich, which are heathlands, let's say, dry heathlands, to a lesser extent wet heathlands. And we've just seen that the 0.3 livestock units that West Government assume would be a sort of, the sort of management you might imagine could work for that. That's going to cost you about £200. And so we're making £200 correspond to this kind of level in the scorecard. And so you'd expect your heathlands to be getting something up to that, and your limestone grasslands to be getting anything up to that. Okay, so you'll notice it's a straight line, and there is another anchor point at the end here, and that's at the lowest possible situation in which we're still delivering public goods. And the value we've used there is £65, and the reason we chose that is because that's roughly the BPS value. Okay, so that's it's a policy choice, isn't it, whether you do it that way, but we think, well, that seems to be a reasonable way to think of it. So people who are delivering just a small amount of public goods are going beyond the minimum standards, and we know they have costs, and so we're suggesting that that could be the way we do it. So this is just that's just a suggestion. Everything else is sort of tied down in figures, in rationales and calculations, but that's just a suggestion. Just to make the point here that this doesn't have to be a straight line at all, in fact. So if you notice here, if we think that this is a good heathland will only score, let's say, 4.5. If it's 4.5, then we only have 9 points, 9 different scores we can give it, and 9 different scores we can manipulate to indicate that. Okay, but it may be that actually most of our commons are in this patch here. So this scope we have here isn't doing anything to help us give messages for these commons. So what you could do, of course, is do it like that. So you could say, well, let's make £200. Let's make that a score of 7. So you'd have to adjust your card, of course, and you have to adjust your card to make it correspond to this. But you could do that, and if you did that, then of course you've got 14 points to play with to give a message to these same commons, and a very much smaller number of points to give a message to the high scoring commons. But maybe you don't care about that because they're more likely to be governed by species anyway, maybe. Or of course you could do the opposite, and I'm not proposing that, but it's just to make the point that all of these are possible. It's just a choice. So just because the first line was straight, it doesn't mean that the line of the payments has to be straight at all. It's something to be judged just purely pragmatically. So just to break down the proposed payments. So what you see is that roughly 45%, let's say, could be things that you could ascribe to Just Cheap, management of Just Cheap. And then there's, what's that, 35% or something, which are additional costs of cattle. And then there's 20% transaction costs in the way we've done it. So that gives you some indicators, some hints of how you might think of allocating the money. There's certainly nothing in any of this that justifies you allocating any of the money to people who are incurring no costs. And that's part of our aim, actually, in the thing, is to give a moral backing to the active graziers, and not to exclude people from being active graziers, but to restrict payment to those who are active graziers. Yeah, okay. So just to go back to no fence collars, just for a while, they're really, yeah, they're very inspiring if you see them. So I would encourage you to go and see ones in action if you can. There's quite a complicated cost structure to how you pay for them. So there's an initial cost, and then there's an annual charge, and then there's also a usage charge, the number of days that the thing is out there being used. And so you have to make some assumptions, a bit like the TB cost, but a bit more complicated. So if you say that there's 6-month usage, and if you depreciate them over 10 years, then it comes to something in the order of £150 per livestock unit per year. And of course, you can convert that to per hectare and all this kind of thing. So we think that there's a lot of mileage in them, but it doesn't make any sense, we don't think, to try and squeeze that into the area payment. Really, it should go to the people that have the collars and that are using them on the common. So we suggest that there should be an action-based payment for that. But just because it's action-based doesn't mean it should be as narrowly prescriptive as the Welsh tradition of agri-environment has been. So, for example, you could say, well, we'll base the payment on a minimum of 5 months or 4 months or whatever during the year. Or you could do it on a payment per day, maybe up to a set maximum. And all these things, of course, are being recorded by the thing itself. So there's no great paperwork involved. The thing is electronic, and it records all these details to prove whatever you need to prove. So we think it has mileage, but only as a complementary or indeed a standalone support. So just the final slide then. So we've talked tonight about the results-based area payments and the rationale for those that we've suggested. It's a solution. It's not necessarily a unique solution. There's different ways of doing it, but I think we would suggest that you have to at least take into account some of the things we've taken into account. There might be more, there might be more subtle ways of doing it we haven't thought about, but these are quite fundamental costs to these businesses, and they need to be taken into account. So we suggest that there should be things alongside that, maybe before that, actually, so cattle collar payments we just talked about. There should be payment for preparatory work, so we'll come back to that in the fourth of the series. And then we're also suggesting that there should be standalone plans for different things, as we discussed last week. So animal health and biosecurity, and that doesn't mean necessarily you have to claim an area payment. They could be useful even if you didn't, and that same applies to fire risk management, maybe peatland restoration, maybe archaeology, public access, whatever. But there's scope for them, and they would need to be funded separately from the area payment. There's also potential for, of course, complementary training and equipment. So it arises maybe particularly for fires, but not just for fires. There's a lot of potential there for joint working, as we discussed last week with the fire rescue services. And finally, of course, there's a need probably in most places for capital works payments. So I was out in Gower this afternoon, and I was having my ear bent that what I should be focusing on was getting a fence along the main road. And I had to say, well, that's not the that's not the topic of the project. That's not, doesn't answer Welsh Government's call, for thinking, as we saw it anyway. But nevertheless, so you have to be sympathetic. I mean, if farmers are losing 60 animals or whatever, these capital works maybe should come first. Maybe they should get more attention. It's just that's not our focus. That's all we're saying. We're not saying that our thing is the only thing that's important. We're just saying that our thing is our thing, and we put the work into that. So there's no, putting up a fence isn't rocket science. It's just that there's lots of legal loopholes and negotiations and pleasing people to go through to do with it, whereas this requires some thinking. So that's the last slide that has any content. Just before I stop sharing, just to remind you that next week we have another webinar at the same time, where my colleague Helen Barnes will be trying to describe how to score a common, how to do it practically, how to prepare for it, what the scorecard asks you, demonstrating a phone app, or the potential of a phone app, and how the presentation of results can help graziers to think about their common and to respond to the signals they're getting. And then also next week, we have an end of project webinar. So it's actually not the final event as we originally thought it would be, because there's another of these 4 to come after it. But it is the final event really. So that's between 2 and 4 on the 12th of October. So you should have had a link come through, or you will have had a link come through from whoever sent you the link, whoever of me or my colleagues sent you the link for this. And if you don't have it, if you don't get it in the next few days, then get in touch with us and we'll send it to you. And then finally, just to say that the video on this event, people had difficulty finding it last time. So that's the URL of the channel. But if you put EFNCP into YouTube, you'll get it comes up as the first suggestion. So it'll be on the YouTube channel in about a couple of days, maybe. Okay, so I'll stop sharing now. And if anybody's got questions, put them in the chat. And we'll try to answer them. No, once again, like last week, everybody's keen for their cup of tea. Okay, so let's leave it like that. Thanks very much indeed for coming tonight, and hope to see you a week from today. Good evening. See you.